Okay, so we are going to continue with the endocrine. We went through and we filled in the worksheet, and now I'm going to, not laboriously, but I'm going to go through the PowerPoint notes that I put up on the course page, because these can be quite helpful to study from. It gives you more pictures, in addition to the images that are already on the course page. Within the PowerPoint itself, there's some very good images, and I like to use them for quiz purposes. So as always, the notes can be used, and you can fill in your worksheets, on your own, because everything you need to fill those in, can be found here within the notes. Starting here in the picture of the body, the different glands of the body. Here's the pituitary gland. We're looking at the difference between the anterior and posterior pituitary. The difference between those is the posterior pituitary is smaller compared to the anterior, and it's this pale staining, stringy kind of an appearance. A on the bottom, because that comes from what I call the cookie sheet models. And then B, the anterior part, that has very distinctively staining cells to the anterior. Posterior pituitary is the neurohypophysis. It's actually nerve tissue that gets pulled down into the sella turcica. And the anterior pituitary is actually glandular tissue from the throat area that gets pulled up while you're embryologically developing, and together they form the pituitary gland. Anterior versus posterior. Anterior is bigger and very granular. Posterior is pale staining and stringy. And so it tells you posterior pituitary stores OT and ADH, and the anterior pituitary TSH, HGH, and ACTH, as well as LH, FSH, and prolactin. All right, so in each of these, it gives you, a feedback loop, the stimulus target site. Sometimes the action and response are separated, sometimes they're kind of together. It tells you the different disorders. Posterior pituitary is oxytocin, an antidiuretic. We'll look at OT more in reproduction. Here we have the adrenal gland. The adrenal gland is a funky one to look at on a slide. I will tell you that some histological slides are very easy to distinguish different glands from one another. The anterior and posterior pituitary is another one. It's quite easy. The adrenal gland, not so much, because the cortex region kind of blends into the medullary region. But there, if someone were going to point to, and from myself included in lab, if I want to point to the adrenal cortex, I generally have the pointer, on the microscope on the surface of the gland. If I'm trying to point to the medulla, I generally go to the internal medial region, where it kind of takes on a Swiss cheese appearance, it starts to have a disintegrated appearance. So either the surface of this gland or the interior of this gland, and it's sort of a Napoleon's hat type of shape, right? So we have regions, the cortex of the outer, the region into the interior is the medulla. In the cortex, we have aldosterone, cortisol, and androgens. The ones you really have to know are aldosterone and cortisol. That is the salt and sugar, because aldosterone pumps essentially salt from urine to pull, to put into blood, and it drags water with it. And cortisol ends up elevating sugar. And the androgens are precursors to sex cells. The adrenal medulla is epinephrine and norepinephrine. Okay, I went too far. Hold on, I hit something. Okay, and the adrenal medulla. Right, so you can read through those. We filled in the worksheet already. Pancreas. Right? We have islets of Langerhans, that B is on top of. You have often a cluster, a little island of pale staining cells, which is where we find our alphas and betas. But outside of that, in the pancreas, we have all these dark purple staining cells, and those function in the digestive system. So we're going to come back to that with the digestive system. All right. Really what we're looking at now, as we're interested in, are those islets of Langerhans, or the pancreatic islets. The alpha cells produce glucagon, the beta cells produce insulin. You don't have to be able to recognize the difference between the alpha and beta there. But let's say there was a pointer on it, and they said which cell would be stimulated with lower than normal blood glucose levels, or, what is the target or the response, to the hormone that beta cells produce. I'm pointing to, which you don't even need to point to the islet of Langerhans. That's really a word question. But anyway, you're not going to have to distinguish between the two there. All right, this just talks about the action of insulin and glucagon. Again, you can read through that on your own. Oh, you know what? That just reminded me of something. You know what? When we were doing the notes, I forgot to give you the hypersecretion for cortisol. And I said that I would come back to it after epinephrine and norepinephrine. And of course, I did not. So when it comes to cortisol in the lab sheets that we just filled out, there's one disorder, and it's called Cushing's. It's a hypercortisol disorder. Hyposecretion is called Addison's disease. Okay, so let me move on. Pancreas. Oh, now we're down to the thyroid gland. This is one of my favorites because the thyroid gland, the histology is very unique. So the one on the top has more purple staining structures, and the one on the bottom has, one on the top has pink staining structures, and one on the bottom has purple staining structures. But if you look at them, they're rather the same in that you have these repeating, they look like little tubes with fluid in the center that takes up stain, right? Because it has a color to it. It's not just transparent. So we have these tubes that look like in the top, you have like pink fluid in the center, and on the bottom, it's rather a very light lavender kind of a color. Well, those are called follicles. So the cells that are immediately to the periphery of that follicle, the single layer cells, are called the follicular cells. And they make the fluid that's in the lumen of this tube system that takes up stain, right? It takes up stain because this is their T3, T4, triiodothyronine and tetraiodothyronine, which means 3 iodine molecules or 4 iodine molecules, and iodine takes up stain. So this is one of the few glands that when you look into the lumen and you see these repeating tubes, so to speak, is that the fluid takes up color. So whether it's a bright orange or pink or a light purple or a medium purple, you're in the thyroid gland, period. Adjacent to it will be the parathyroid gland. And when you see this type of tissue, and then next to it or off to one side, it looks like just homogeneous cells, sort of like the anterior pituitary. It's just a bunch of cells without these, little tubes, tube systems or fluid containing follicles within it. That they're trying to tell you, you are looking at the thyroid and parathyroid glands, and then address the question, which side is it pointing to? But I'll show you in just a second. Okay, so the picture down to the lower right-hand side, shows you B, which is identifying the cells that surround that follicle that are the follicular cells. And then A is giving a really good example of parafollicular cells, clusters of cells found in a little lumpy doodle, like a little cluster there, that are just amassed there. They're not contributing or surrounding a particular follicle. So those are the parafollicular cells. Right? Follicular cells surround a follicle. Parafollicular cells are just in a clump or a mass like that. So the parafollicular cells produce calcitonin, and the follicular cells produce T3, T4. Remember that the follicular cells are the target of thyroid stimulating hormone. All right, so, someone pointed, let's say I pointed to A and I said, what is the stimulus for the release of the hormone from, these cells? Well, they respond to varying levels of calcium, right? Higher than normal blood calcium levels. But the stimulus for the cells B, those follicular cells to produce T3, T4, the stimulus is thyroid stimulating hormone from the anterior pituitary. Okay. All right, parathyroid glands are found at the posterior aspect of the thyroid gland, and you may see 4 to 6 of these. Looks like jelly beans or marbles on the back of the thyroid gland. Right? And then when we look at the slide, you see how the parathyroid gland looks rather homogeneous, whereas the thyroid, again, you can see these follicles, fluid-filled tube systems there. And generally, what I do is if I'm going to ask you about the anterior and posterior pituitary, I'm going to quickly go back. I'm going to give you a region like this in a cell where you have the granular portion and the stringy portion. And the pointer is either pointing to the posterior pituitary or the anterior pituitary, but you see them together because that helps you identify where you're at, essentially. And I do the same thing for the thyroid, parathyroid, is that if I'm going to point to the parathyroid, I find an area where you have thyroid and parathyroid coming together, and then I just point to one or the other. Generally, if they're coming together like that, it's because I'm trying to identify the parathyroid gland. I don't need to have the parathyroid gland there to help you identify the thyroid gland. Like in these pictures here, they are just uniquely thyroid gland. It's kind of like looking at an osteon and compact bone. You can't confuse it with anything else, hopefully. Okay, so this gives you the breakdown: stimulus, target site action, response, disorders, associated with thyroxine, T3, T4. And please check. I might have said something incorrectly about cretinism. Did I say it was a hyper T3, T4? If I did, I apologize. It's a hypo secretion of T3, T4 that causes cretinism. Cretinism is referred to as the cat's cry in infants. So please check if you filled that in. If I said hyper secretion of T3, T4, I apologize. It's hypo. Mixed edema is definitely hypo, because that's a very slowing down of your metabolic process, and hyper secretion is Graves' disease. Excuse me. Okay, parathyroid hormone. This takes us to the cookie sheet models, what I call them. So here up at the top, level with the brain, pituitary gland over to the right, anterior on the A, posterior pituitary is on the B. Then we move down the body a little bit to the thyroid, to the throat area, where your larynx is. That's where you find your thyroid gland. So C represents looking, anterior to posterior, right to the front of your thyroid. D is you're looking at the backside. So D is pointing to those parathyroid glands, right? C is thyroid, D is parathyroid. All the tissues here in the center are referred to as like general body cells. We have over to the left, E and F, we have the adrenal gland, the cortex to the superficial region, and the medullary region, F, is pointing to the medullary region of the adrenal gland. The cortex, here we produce aldosterone and cortisol, and in the medulla we have epinephrine and norepinephrine. Over to the right, G, we're pointing to the pancreas. So here we look at those islets of Langerhans, alpha cells, beta cells. There are reproductive organs to the bottom, but those could be used in the reproductive system. All right, the endocrine baby, I call it naked baby on a plate. Here, A is pointing to the thyroid gland in green, and don't forget the thymus gland is, anterior to the heart in the thoracic cavity, where we have thymosin that stimulates T lymphocyte maturation. So don't forget those. I mean, it's a valid question. Not too many people pull out, a hormone from a previous chapter, but, or lab, but technically it's fair game. Okay, so let's go back up to the top and let's get into the images so I can help you point out whatever you need to see there. I'm going to stop my share and I'm going to go into a different, I think. This is probably good. Okay, let me go to course content and hopefully this will follow. I'm going to stop my share and reshare it again because I'm getting paranoid now. And I think I need another decongestant. I just want to make sure. Yep, it would have followed. Okay. Sometimes when you change pages, the share function doesn't travel with you. All right, so let's go through these images and let me help you, or let me try to point out what you need to know. It's a little sideways, but this is that cookie sheet model. This is a newer version where we have level with the brain, the pituitary gland, anterior in the greeny part and posterior in the pale staining region. We have the thyroid gland immediately below it, and to the left of that, the parathyroid glands on the back of the thyroid. Directly below it is the adrenal gland, cortex and medulla. Over to the right, you would have the alpha and beta cells of the islets of Langerhans. So something that might be asked. All right, let me just give you an example. maybe I could point to the posterior pituitary, the pale staining region, and put in and like a letter A on that. And I could say, what hormone from A? And then I put a B on a kidney. And I said, targets B. And so you go, oh God, I don't know. But there's a logic to it. Posterior pituitary, there are only two hormones, oxytocin and antidiuretic. We haven't even talked about oxytocin. And antidiuretic sounds like something that the kidneys would be involved in. So antidiuretic targets the kidneys. Or I could point to the anterior pituitary and say, hey, what hormone from here targets, what if I put an arrow on the thyroid gland? And again, you go into panic mode, but don't, because you only have to know three right now: thyroid stimulating hormone, adrenal corticotropic hormone, or human growth hormone. So the hormone from the anterior pituitary that targets the thyroid gland is probably the thyroid stimulating hormone. Similarly, what hormone from the anterior pituitary targets maybe general body cells? Right? Well, it wouldn't be thyroid stimulating hormone. And I won't be adrenal corticotropic hormone. Adrenal corticotropic hormone would target the adrenal cortex, of that adrenal gland. So from the anterior pituitary targeting general body cells would be human growth hormone. And from the anterior pituitary targeting the adrenal cortex, right, would be adrenal corticotropic hormone. Okay, I'm going to go to the next one real quick, so I don't take up a lot of your time. All right, so again, 3 is posterior pituitary, 2, that whole gland, darker staining cells region, and larger region is the anterior pituitary. Be able to identify it, know what hormones come from there and what their functions are. Their basic functions, why it's stimulated and what does it do. Okay, so I said, oh, and so Dr. Brightman did this too. He said, what hormone from A targets B? Thyroid stimulating hormone, right? I gotta move this thing over. All right. What hormone from A targets B? The superficial layer of the adrenal gland. That would be adrenal corticotropic hormone. Remember, you always want to use, these are made by another instructor. This works for him. We often use them because we had a former image base that we used to have that tanked on us, so to speak. We couldn't maintain it on a separate web page or something like that. It was the reason. But in any event, you always want to use these pictures of models and use the lab exercises we did in class, or I just Zoomed. Those are the things you apply to these models. Most of them are going to be the same, but when in doubt, if I identify, and I do sometimes, different things for you to know, or sometimes additional things for you to know, then, that's your Bible. Okay, so that's that image goes with that. Parathyroid glands on the back of the thyroid gland. Right, adrenal cortex versus adrenal medulla. The medulla is at 12, where you see all the blood vessels, kind of pinky area. All right, so these you can kind of go through on your own. Here's your islets and Langerhans. Alpha cells, glucagon, beta cells, insulin. They're negative feedback loops. All right, here we have to the right. This isn't the best picture. I think the pictures in my notes, like I'm more likely to use something like that. But to the right here at the pointer with the anterior pituitary and posterior pituitary on the other side, it's sometimes hard to take pictures of slides, through the ocular piece of a microscope. I ended up, just using, put it on the screen in the front of the lab, and then I took pictures there like this, right? This is actually on the screen, and he's pointing to it with a yardstick or something. That's a little bit better. This is the adrenal gland that I was telling you about. So if someone was going to point to the adrenal cortex, you generally point like this to the surface. Here, do you see how that's starting to break up? I'm pointing to an area that kind of looks Swiss cheesy. That would be considered the medulla. I mean, the cortex goes deeper than that, don't get me wrong, but generally the surface of the adrenal gland versus the interior of the deep interior of the adrenal gland. So the surface is adrenal cortex, and you see how that starts to break up in there, kind of Swiss cheese looking. That would be the adrenal medulla. Rather quickly to get through this. Okay, we're looking at the thyroid gland. You see those island, those tube systems, and the material in the lumen is taking up stain. Those are the follicular cells that surround that follicle. And then kind of right above it, like around here that I'm pointing to, you can see a great big cluster of just a lump of different, of homogeneous looking cells, right? Those would be the parafollicular cells. Follicular cells versus parafollicular cells. Okay, follicular cells produce T3, T4. It's targeted by thyroid stimulating hormone, and it increases T3, T4 levels. It increases metabolic rate. Right now we're pointing to the parafollicular cells here. Right, and here, see, oh, look, thyroid versus parathyroid. All right, so when you get those two areas together, it really helps you identify the parathyroid. Here, this becomes a little harder in the pancreas. We have islets of Langerhans that are pale staining. And usually, I'm not sure where this slide is from. I think it's an older slide, but generally you can, those islets of Langerhans are pretty pale. And when you magnify them, to about high power, you lose a lot of the resolution. So low power is sometimes the best magnification level to use. And it also depends on how old the slide is, if it's kind of bleached out or not. But that represents the islets of Langerhans, where you find alpha and beta cells. And then I think that's it. I got a little zippy at the end there, but I couldn't remember how many pictures are there. Okay, so apply all the the lessons that we covered in our lab guides to these different images. I will say I use a good amount from my lab notes, because some of those images from the PowerPoint slides are easier to see and distinguish. Okay, thank you.